Hi everyone, we are back with an interesting talk. We have Shamim Prashantham, author of Gorillas Can Dance, talking about his book and the corporate innovation around it. So over to you, Shamim.
Thank you very much, Kanish, and great to be at this event. I'm very grateful to Ajay for having invited me first to the East Africa event a few weeks ago and now to this event in India. I'm professor at a business school called China Europe International Business School in Shanghai and associate dean of the MBA program. This book is the result of about 15 years of research looking at different companies and how they went about learning to partner with startups. And I also had the opportunity to study this phenomenon in different geographies. So I'm going to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour of this book, and hopefully it abstracts some of the ideas that you're hearing from other speakers and have also encountered yourself in your own work. So the company that I've been studying the most is Microsoft. And so I was lucky to, over a decade ago, start observing how, first of all, this very interesting guy called Dana Lewin, who as a young man had been part of the Macintosh team at Apple and was the only non-techie guy that Steve Jobs took with him when he left Apple to start Next. Daniel became, the Silicon Valley insider who then later in his career joined Microsoft to help Microsoft navigate the Silicon Valley ecosystem. And that was the beginnings of Microsoft's efforts to engage with startups, which culminated in 2008 with the launch of what they call the BizSpark program to engage with startups. And then, in a way, the baton was passed to this guy called Zach Weisfeld in Israel, who set up this accelerator program in 2012 in Tel Aviv. And actually the same year, Microsoft introduced accelerators in Bangalore and Beijing. And over time, Microsoft got to a point where you saw Satya Nadella have a little plaque on his table that said, Microsoft loves startups. And I heard the Microsoft for Startups guy in China, James Cho, pretty much saying the same thing. And it's been a very interesting study to see how Microsoft, which was initially actually not well regarded in the startup ecosystem, make a concerted effort to learn how to do this. And what I could see is that even a tech company, tech giant, can face disruption. And that led me to recognize three key aspects of this process. The why, whereby the big company really needs to be aligning what they're doing in the corporate innovation space with their overall strategy. The how, which is ultimately to be able to co-create with startups. And finally, the where, which involves co-evolving with ecosystems in different parts of the world. So this is the structure of the book, and I'd like to give you just a very quick feel for the why, the how, and the where. So starting off with the why, I think this is something that you're hearing from a lot of the speakers, and you see this yourselves, which is the starting point of why large corporations are seeking to be entrepreneurial is the disruption they face. And so it is as if managers in the large companies face a threat from entrepreneurs in startups as they pursue new opportunities, especially leveraging digitalization and developing new business models, leveraging very new ways of thinking and developing ecosystem value, and of course, acting in a very nimble fashion. But the point is that being entrepreneurial isn't just for startups. The attributes of being proactive, of being innovative, of taking calculated risks is something that even large companies can and should exhibit. And so you have this greater emphasis now that on managers acting as entrepreneurs. One way to do that, of course, is to encourage internally oriented intrapreneurship programs. But over time, we've begun to see how intrapreneurs may also seek to help their company by engaging with external startups. And that then takes us to this idea of managers with entrepreneurs. And I was very interested to study the work of Intel in China, where they have this very interesting entrepreneurship program called GrowthX, which a guy called Kapil Kane drives. But even he found, this is a program for their internal engineering teams to do something entrepreneurial. Even he found that if these teams connected with external startups, then they went even faster in terms of going to market. And so it seems that there's this big opportunity for a win-win. On the one hand, each side has something that the other wants, and so there's complementarity in terms of scale and agility. However, there is a but, and I think that is why there is so much interest in this topic. On the one hand, there should be very good complementarity, but in reality, it's proving to be difficult to engage. And I attribute this to this idea that partnering actually isn't very easy, to what I call the paradox of asymmetry. The guy who started the Unilever Foundry program for startups basically says, we as in managers in big companies come from this background of plan and perfect. It's the antithesis of the entrepreneurial environment. And I think the problem is that the very differences that make it attractive to work together also makes it difficult, or at least not straightforward, to partner with each other. And so in terms of thinking about the how, then you understand that there's a why, but there's also it's very difficult, is to unpack what these asymmetries are. And what I've observed over time, as I said, this research has taken place for over a decade, is that three key asymmetries are at play. An asymmetry of goals. The companies are dealing or pursuing different things, and also at different timescales. An asymmetry of structure. When two big companies partner together, it's relatively easy to find role counterparts, much more difficult when it's a corporate and a startup. An asymmetry of attention, in the sense that the big company looks out and sees an ocean of startups and needs to figure out who to prioritize their scarce managerial attention to. The startups know who the big companies are, but struggle to identify whose attention, which specific individuals, decision makers, they should attract the attention of. And so when we come to the how, then a big part of this is addressing each of these asymmetries. And what I've observed, looking not just at Microsoft, but at different companies, the ones that figured out, as this guy from Silicon Valley Bank, Gerald Brady, pointed out, if companies don't talk to startups, they're at risk. The bit that companies need to get right is partnering. And so the ones that have actually worked on this for a while, I find, do three things. The first is they clarify the synergy. This helps to address the asymmetry of goals. The second is that they create interfaces. This helps to address this asymmetry of structure. And thirdly, they cultivate exemplars and thereby address the asymmetry of attention. So let me just speak to each of these very briefly. So the starting point is the synergy, and it might sound blindingly obvious, but in reality, you find that although this term win-win is bandied about a lot, exactly the nature of the win for each party isn't extremely clear. And I've noticed that there are two generic types of synergies that companies may pursue. One is what I call building block synergies. And traditionally, we've seen the likes of Microsoft and IBM and SAP pursue this. They have technological building blocks. They want startups to build on top of this. And the logic here is basically of a co-sell synergy. Whereas more traditional companies like BMW, like Unilever, like Bayer, like Barclays Bank, they tend to come at this from a pain point perspective. They are seeking to increasingly digitalize, address issues like cybersecurity, which they may not have the capabilities for, but they seek to work with startups. And so this becomes a sell to us synergy, but not in a hands-off vendor relationship, but in a much more strategic way. And this clarifies then what the nature of the win is for both parties. But of course, then that requires the next step, which is creating the interface. So if I'm a startup trying to engage with the big company, who should my first port of call be? And this is where we've seen this rise of different types of programmatic interventions, BMW Startup Garage, Unilever Foundry, that kind of thing. And sometimes people are a little bit skeptical about these and say this is about innovation theater. But at a minimum, what happens as a result is the startup has a port of call, a contact point, which then helps, at least in the first instance, to build a bridge. However, that, of course, of itself is also insufficient. And the third and most important step is creating success stories, exemplars at an early stage. And the rub is this: when you have people at the interface, the people who are running Unilever Foundry or BMW Startup Garage, or there's a program called Walmart Omega 8, or whatever it is, they have incentives to engage with startups, but the startups will only have meaningful opportunities to work with the big company if they get a chance to work with different business units. And those business unit leaders might be skeptical. But when there are success stories early on, then both parties are able to see what success might look like. It helps each to prioritize their attention better. And in fact, this is what I find to be the key differentiator between the companies that take this startup partnering seriously and do it well. And this is a remarkably consistent pattern I've been seeing, irrespective of the industry or geography. But of course, this can give you a way to do this once. You need to, if you're serious about this as a big company, also build the capability to partner with startups, which is different from the capability of engaging with very similar peers. And so once you know the process, making it more repetitive, replicable, it becomes the important thing. Now, of course, step one, though, is initiation. And very often, this is where you see the entrepreneurial bottom-up efforts of people. Sometimes they begin small, but the important thing is that they begin. The Bayer program in Berlin called Grants for Apps started in 2012 because one scientist called Jesus Del Val decided he was going to try giving small grants to students to create mobile health apps. And so it became called Grants for Apps, or G4A for short. And then the following year, he thought, well, it doesn't have to be students, it can be startups. The following year, they said, okay, let's have a small accelerator program in Berlin. The following year, they said, well, it doesn't have to be local startups, it can be global startups, and they brought in some from outside. And then the subsidiaries in different countries started doing this, and eventually it became a much more systematic thing, and a different person was brought in to run this, because by then it was felt that Jesus may not be the right person. So the initiation, expansion, and systematization becomes important. Initiation is often bottom-up entrepreneurial effort, sometimes beginning, asking for forgiveness rather than permission. That's how the BMW startup garage guy, Gregor Gimi, described to me how he got started creating a website and a small meeting room with a very funky design without getting permission from corporate identity. And the next day he got a phone call from them and he thought he was in trouble, but they called to congratulate him. But of course, when you expand, then these guerrilla tactics aren't enough. That's where getting buy-in from the leadership, from peers and business units, and also just more broadly, sort of roving ambassadors who are willing to play the role of mentors and generally be supportive. And finally, then it's about aligning this with strategy. And this is where I think Microsoft have done a tremendous job over a period of time. Satya Nadella realigning the sales incentives such that the incentives are identical, whether you're selling Microsoft products or Microsoft partner solutions that are part of their co-sell repository, which could include solutions from startup partners. And all of this is important because now big companies are, in a sense, competing with others for the hearts and minds of the best startups. And so being seen as capable in startup partnering and a good partner is actually important. The starting point, though, very often is entrepreneurial individuals to get started. And even over time, the interfaces that have worked the best I've seen are where there are people, individuals who are able to bridge these two worlds, which are extremely difficult. You know, a former entrepreneur who's come into a big company, or a big company manager who's especially entrepreneurial. The third piece that I want to briefly talk about, and then I'd be happy to take any questions, is the fact that these multinational companies have the opportunity to harness talent around the world. And of course, India has become a fantastic entrepreneurial ecosystem. And the main point I want to make here is the importance of dealing with different entrepreneurial ecosystems differently. Any local context can be classified as an emerging economy or an advanced economy, high reputation location, or a low reputation location. So, you know, the Silicon Valleys, the Thames Valley region in London, Berlin, these advanced market clusters, that's sort of the default very often for these large multinationals, and is probably the most straightforward there to be engaging with startups. But even in advanced markets, there are places like Glasgow, for example, where COP26 was took place not that long ago, where I have also studied Western multinationals, American companies engaging with local startups, and in places without a critical mass of startups. Now, how did that happen? Very often I find it has to do with policy intervention. So in Glasgow, there was a program called Scottish Technology and Collaboration, where the local government was the honest broker trying to link their multinational subsidiaries with local startups. And so that extra hand-holding might be needed in those places which are a little bit off the beaten path. Now, emerging markets, which is of particular interest to us, is of course also has its very impressive startup ecosystems. We saw a picture of Lagos in the very first presentation, where I've also done some research. But in China, for example, there's Shenzhen or the Zhongguancun district in Beijing. Of course, Bangalore has had a long reputation in developing amazing startups. And here what you find typically is that the multinational has also great opportunities, but a need to adapt a little bit to the local ecosystem, to compensate for the areas that need developing, and latching on to the areas where there's such a huge appetite, and in fact, new innovations that aren't actually seen in advanced markets. And interestingly, in some emerging market, low reputation locations, again, the non-Bangalores of the world, and I was born in a place called Vellore, so I'm very sympathetic to places which are, again, not on the beaten path. Again, you find that with government intervention, it can be possible to engage. But again, here, it might have to be done in a slightly non-standard way. And here is where I think even policymakers can be entrepreneurial. There's a city in China called Ningbo, which you may or may not have heard of. It's not a high-tech hub. Yet even there, I've seen IBM partner with startups because local government officials in the Smart City program used it very cleverly to attract IBM in the first place and then facilitate their interaction with local startups. Of course, the vast majority of interactions with startups will happen in the innovation hotspots, you know, the Bangalores and Silicon Valleys of the world. But having had this recent conference that was put on in Africa, and given the fact that not everybody lives in the Bangalores and the Shenzhens of the world, I think it's useful to also recognize that there are possibilities, but additional support is needed. Speaking of Africa, this is a place that I've been also doing some research lately, and you see there's not only the usual suspects like Microsoft and IBM who are active there, but even emerging market multinationals like Alibaba have an important role to play, and some of the entrepreneurs there might in fact be able to get more inspiration from emerging market multinationals that have succeeded under conditions of limited infrastructure, which is their reality, as opposed to the way in which Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk might be succeeding. And that also takes me to the final point, which particularly observing social entrepreneurs in Africa made me realize that we have this huge opportunity to leverage corporate startup partnering as a force for good. The Seed Stars speaker said that they're aligning increasingly with the Sustainable Development Goals, which I was very happy to hear. And if you look at that 17th Sustainable Development Goal, partnerships for the goals, I think actually partnering between non-traditional allies, large and small, is actually an important piece of the puzzle here. And some of the examples I've seen, for example, there's a startup in Bangalore called Cloud Physician providing remote ICU services. They're an alum of the Cisco Launchpad, and that's a very direct contribution to SDG 3, and particularly during the second wave in India earlier this year, their services were invaluable, especially for hospital in second and third tier cities. Kusini is a South African-based startup that creates water filters using frugal innovation, and they partnered with DHL. So actually, this was more like DHL's CSR program. They had 50 depots in South Africa where they installed Kusini water facilities, making clean water available in some hard-to-reach parts of the country. Budweiser in China, working with a Chinese startup called Metero to turn their waste, including beer cans and so on, into eco-friendly plastic. And so again, there's huge opportunity, and I would say necessity, for more and more of these types of engagements. And in fact, Microsoft, the company that I've studied for the longest, just before COVID became a worldwide problem at the end of February last year, announced this Global Social Entrepreneurship Program. So just to wrap things up, I think if you take a step back, what you see in all of these examples of multinational companies and startups engaging are three mindsets which are extremely important. An entrepreneurial mindset, and that reflects the why, a collaborative mindset, and that pertains to the how, and a global mindset, which relates to the where. And that applies not only to this relatively narrow domain that we're interested in, corporate innovation, corporate startup partnering, for example, but the broader issues of organizational transformation and even more broadly, societal impact. And I think in this, at the moment, entrepreneurship is hot, globalization is not. I firmly believe in the importance of entrepreneurship for sure, but I also think it's premature to let go of a global mindset. Of course, there are headwinds and you have to deal with the reality, but the idea that we can learn from elsewhere, that we can contribute to challenges and problems elsewhere, I think is an important one to hold on to. And as Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, says, it's imperative for large organizations to partner with more nimble startups to help create a better world. And so that's my brief overview, whistle-stop tour of this book, which I understand is the first book on this topic, corporate startup partnering. At least that's the sort of feedback I've been getting the last couple of months since the book dropped in the US. And now in the last few days, it's become available in pretty much most markets of the world. So once again, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share some of these ideas. And if there are any comments, questions, I look forward to them.
Thanks, Shamim. Any questions? We can take one or two questions, and we have a comment from Win. Good session. Any questions? Feel free to.
Elephants was already dancing. Good to see the gorillas dance. Yeah.
What is the best way to shift the mindset of large organizations to become entrepreneurial?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is something that, of course, a lot of companies deal with. And I think two things are needed, both a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach. Meaning that if there are leaders at the top who clearly signal that it's important to become entrepreneurial, this will help. And one of the sort of top-down ways of doing this is to actually introduce an intrapreneurship program. One of the best ones I've observed is at Samsung, where they bid for proposals and then shortlist, screen out, and select a few, which they then maybe give 6 months of support to. and relieve the person from their day-to-day responsibilities and their team, and then evaluate things. And then, it's typically a 2-year cycle. And then if everything goes to plan and they have a very strong prototype, it's usually displayed at the CES stand of Samsung in Vegas. So this sort of thing then basically shows to people within the company that they're serious about this. And of course, the most tricky part in this is the majority of these projects will fail. What do you do in terms of the career path for those people? So that's one approach. But the other is actually very often it's bottom-up efforts. So as many of you would have heard of how Sony came up with PlayStation, through the efforts of a very sort of ordinary middle-level engineer called Ken Kutaragi, just because he thought that Sony should do something better in this space than was available from Nintendo. And when he asked his colleagues, shall I go with this idea to my boss? They said, don't, because the answer will be no. I have a co-author who calls this the corporate immune system. Headquarters is sort of conditioned to say no. And so sometimes one of the best ways to shift the mindset of the large company, especially if you are not at the top, is to actually start pushing and making small changes. And actually, a lot of the startup pathway programs that I've come across initially started like that. Even Unilever Foundry, which is now big and well organized. I mean, Jeremy Bassett was pushing this and made it happen. So that's a very brief response to that, but clearly one of the ongoing challenges. So it's a great question.
We have one. How do we shift mindsets of youth to innovate for large organizations?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the large organizations should sort of reach out to the youth even more. But I think it's simply this, that and by the way, for a startup, engaging with a big company, I don't think is always necessary or a given. So I think part of this is just being clear about, from a startup's point of view, when it makes sense. I call this book Gorillas Can Dance, and it's actually a play on a title of a much earlier article I wrote called Dancing with Gorillas, from the point of view of the startup. And I think it resonated with a lot of people because startups can get trampled in the process. So there's a hint of danger. So I mean, everybody, including young entrepreneurs, should realize this and go in with their eyes open. But I think it's important to basically educate entrepreneurs about some of the benefits of engaging with an organization that has more resources and scale. And I think that would apply to youth more generally. And when they see that other youth are able to benefit from this, and there are growing examples, which is why this piece around exemplars becomes important. The more big companies can showcase these examples, and it's not just youth, I mean, even women entrepreneurs, ethnic minority entrepreneurs, just to show that they're more inclusive and that what matters is the idea, I think that will help.
All right. So this was a great keynote from you, Shamim, and we had some great questions also. Thanks for taking those.
Thank you very much.
Comment or the question? Most Fortune 500 companies have partnerships with vendors, which has great advantages from both the sides. It would be great if SMEs startup comes mainstream.
I fully agree, and in fact, there's a lot that SMEs can do, more established than startups, especially in terms of providing some of the capabilities relating to SDGs that big companies are needing. And yes, so I totally agree. And actually, there's more and more of a push for supply chains to include SMEs and to do this in a way that is in compliance with a lot of ESG requirements, which means that on the one hand, SMEs should be treated more fairly, and also that SMEs may have certain capabilities that are valuable to make these supply chains more resilient and more sustainable.
Perfect. So with this, thank you so much, Shamim. Great hosting you here, and we had some wonderful questions and thoughts coming out.
Thank you so much, Kanish. Really enjoyed this.
Yeah. Audience, stay tuned. We have something interesting coming right after this. We have awards that we're kind of announcing next. So please stay tuned. I'll be right back.